welcome to the Better Gaming Show, where we discuss all aspects of ethical gambling and gaming and how we can make it safe, secure and socially balanced for everyone. So today we are diving into one of gaming's most controversial features, and that is loot boxes. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Leon Xiao, a leading researcher who's been at the forefront of documenting and analysing how these mechanisms work and what they mean for players. Leon's research has directly influenced policy debates around the world, and he's here to help me understand what's really going on when children and adults spend money on these boxes. Leon, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me on.
There is a bit of a time shift, as Dr. Leon is an assistant professor at the City University of Hong Kong. I'm really looking forward to this chat because it's an area which I believe needs some real focus. And loot boxes first came on my radar a few years back when my son was asking to buy something on his Xbox, and it didn't quite sit right with me that he would be playing a game with this transaction. And one of the key observations was articulating and defining what I was being presented with. So I guess my first question is, can you give me a clear definition of what is a loot box, and if I'm playing a game and I see one, how they work?
Sure, of course. So loot boxes are in-game purchases that you can make inside video games. So instead of buying the software, a lot of games now are offered to players for free, but once they are inside the game, they're given many opportunities to purchase things inside the game. But what's different about loot boxes from other in-game purchases is that when you spend money, you don't know what you're going to get. Your rewards are randomized, and most of the time you won't get what you're looking for, but rarely you will. And what that happens is that the game is encouraging people to make multiple purchases to try to get the rare rewards.
Okay. And so are there different types of loot boxes in terms of the games you're playing and the mechanisms that are within that?
Sure. I think there are certainly many different ways to subdivide loot boxes as a concept into a smaller categories. So, for example, one word that players of generally games made in Asia on mobile phones, in those games, players don't call these mechanics that give random rewards in exchange for money necessarily loot boxes. They will call them gacha. So that would be one way in which they might be differentiated. But I think the subdivisions doesn't matter too much for the purposes of regulation, because we are just concerned more generally about this phenomenon where people are spending real money for random rewards in a gambling-like manner, but without the protection of gambling regulation. But certainly, if you want to look into the different subcategories, we have, for example, loot boxes that will give players rewards that make them stronger in the game so that they can be more competitive against other players. So literally, you can get from this loot box a weapon that would deal more damage to other players, thus giving them a competitive advantage. But in other games with their loot boxes, what you get will be purely cosmetic. It just changes how your character looks. Yes, it looks cooler, the rare rewards are nicer, but it doesn't change necessarily gameplay in terms of beating other players.
Okay, so therein is inherently one of the big problems with it in terms of playability and winnability, in that so much that when you're talking about the randomized chances of the actual loot boxes is on one side, but the likelihood of you winning or having an enhanced play from that game is pretty much diminished if you're not purchasing these loot boxes. Would that be fair to say?
I think this does depend on the individual game. Certainly, there are many games out there where if you do not engage with the loot box mechanic, including not spending a substantial sums of money on the loot boxes, you will not be competitive enough to play against other players on an equal footing. But there are also other games out there where the loot box rewards really do not change the gameplay. Yes, it can make your characters look more interesting, but it's not necessary. It is true that in some games, it is more important than others.
Okay. I think the other element, and I was listening to a podcast and in turn one of your LinkedIn posts about the disclosure of the loot boxes in terms of its playability and the likelihood of getting the reward or the prize that you wanted for. In terms of disclosure and transparency of the odds of winning and getting rare items, how transparent and fair is the system as it currently lands today?
So you're absolutely right that in the UK now, there is this industry self-regulation that was come up with by the industry. The government organized for this to happen. And what is required is that game companies must tell players of their likelihood of getting different rewards from loot boxes. But what we have found through our research is that although it is now generally true that the main loot box mechanic in most games, so the most obvious mechanics, do have a probability disclosure, we can very often, more often than not, and really, if I remember correctly, more than 80% of the time, find other loot boxes within those games that still do not have probability disclosures. So in terms of providing a probability disclosure for all loot boxes in the same game, which of course is required, the compliance is not good. And we're also unfortunately not seeing sufficient or indeed any enforcement of those rules. They're just sort of there as this paper tiger requiring these transparencies. But even though companies don't provide them, nothing much is happening to them as a result.
I remember as well seeing about the spin wheel and the chances of people winning. And it was pretty much saying that, if they had 8 outcomes, then it would give it an even wedge of that wheel, as it were. Whereas the likelihood of winning one of the more prized gifts, as it were, on air only had a 7% chance. So should have only really had a 7% wedge of that 360 degrees. And it's the presentation of these sort of elements that I'm really struggling with.
Yes, you're referring to a particular case where the loot box was presented as this prize wheel, and of course, if that prize wheel existed in real life, we do expect your probabilities of winning each wedge to be equal to how big that particular wedge is. But unfortunately, in this video game, they presented all the wedges as equal, even though the probabilities of it landing on them was not equal. So that was something that did not correspond to real life. That was particularly misleading. That doesn't happen too often. Like actively misleading representations don't happen too often. What we see tends to be a lack of disclosure at all, or alternatively, insufficiently detailed disclosures. So for example, and this is, it's a rather extreme example, but we have seen quite a few games do this. It will say things such as, you have, from this particular loot box, 100% chance of getting gold. But that's not the point of this loot box. Yes, you use this loot box to get gold, but what is being randomized is the amount of gold that you get. People don't care that they are guaranteed to get gold. Everybody knows that already. What they care about is actually you only have a 1% chance, for example, of getting 1,000 gold, but a 99% chance of getting 1 gold. People want to know that, but that information is not being provided.
Okay. So just moving it on quickly, just with regard to what I referenced earlier about my son, he's 10 years old. He plays Roblox. He does EAFC, which used to be FIFA, and
Yes.
he also plays Fortnite. When it comes to these mechanisms and how they're infiltrating games, how worried should I be that this almost gambling mechanism, well, I say almost, it is a gambling mechanism, is being infiltrated into these games for the younger kids?
So, as you said, I think you are actually conscious of the existence of these mechanics in the game that your son is playing. I think that's quite good because you know what games they are. Perhaps you've also played those yourself, and maybe you even play those games with him. That really helps because then you can understand what these mechanics are, how they might encourage young people to spend money. What I am more concerned about are the parents who do not pay so much attention to the exact games that they're playing. Because, of course, a child might come to their parents and ask for, let's say, can I spend £5 or £10 on something inside this game? They don't quite explain what this something is because it would just be some, let's say, Robux in Roblox. That's the premium currency that you can buy with real money to redeem. They don't tell you that after getting the Robux, they're actually going to engage with a gambling-like mechanic. It's that detail that would be missing unless the parent actually pays specific attention to this issue. And one important thing, and this is actually a requirement under UK consumer law, is that video games are supposed to tell people whether or not that it contains these mechanics. So if you look at an advertisement for a video game, or if you look at the App Store listing for a video game, it should say visually prominently that this game contains loot boxes if that is the case. So one can make an informed decision about whether or not to download it and to play it. And not only for themselves as a player, but also as a parent, you want to make that informed decision for your kids. But what we find is that a lot of companies do not make this disclosure. They do not say whether their game contains loot boxes or not, by which I mean they do not say that the game contains loot boxes when it does. So people are making uninformed decisions and getting into these games, not knowing the potential risks that are involved. But as I said at the start, I think what you're doing is absolutely correct. And that's what should be recommended here, is to play those games with your kids so that you actually understand what is going on. Because what I am concerned about is for parents to say, okay, no video games for you because of these mechanics. This can lead to negative consequences, because we're looking at situations where, of course, for example, Roblox, that is an online community, and also where even for children, they would go there to play with their offline friends, their schoolmates. And if you just prohibit them from accessing that platform at all, they will miss out on a lot of social opportunities. I think it's about engaging with these games in a way that is responsible, or rather parents, of course, the responsibility is on the companies not to be implementing predatory mechanics. But because of the lack of regulation and the lack of enforcement, the situation is as it is. And unfortunately, it is incumbent on parents now to watch out for their kids.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment as well. And one of the elements that I'm, as a parent, am looking at doing is educating my son about the whole aspects of winning and losing and understanding odds as well. So I think it's really important for him to appreciate that there are mechanisms out there and that this is something that is part of life. I guess it feels like an irresponsible statement, but it feels sensible as well, because he's got to understand these are sort of mechanics that happen in everyday life as well.
I mean, I think that you're right in that it is the reality that we do live in, right? Gambling is something that is legalized, by which I mean traditional gambling. So if you completely hide children away from these mechanics and don't tell anything to them about the risks involved, and then suddenly they've turned 18 and now they can participate in traditional gambling and they didn't get any risk-taking related education, that might be quite problematic as well, as you can obviously see. So yeah, and I can agree with that sentiment. That, yes, certainly talking to your kids about the risks would be a good idea.
Yeah, no, an example would be just the EAFC player packs, where my son understands that he's got a set amount of money that he wants to buy the player packs, and he's hopeful that he will get Messi, Ronaldo within that pack. And essentially he gets players that he's either not heard of or, are just lesser status players. So, it's that randomized element that he's just got to accept, and that there's a limit on the controls that he's done. Do you think the industry's doing enough in terms of, you hear examples of children spending parents' money, hundreds and thousands of pounds worth on loot packs? Do you think the industry is setting enough guidance and safety rails on the spend of loot boxes?
I mean, in terms of whether guidance has been set, there has been no sort of spending limit per month or per day or anything like that. In contrast, in mainland China, there has been regulation specifically setting out spending limits for under 18s. This could be something that a video game decides to implement on an account-by-account basis. I recognize some problems with trying to enforce this, because a child might decide to open a second account and then they can evade some of these restrictions. But a lot of these games, to be honest, I don't think people are incentivized at all. In fact, they're disincentivized to have multiple accounts. So such restrictions might actually work. But going back to the question, no, such spending limits have not been set as part of the industry self-regulation guidance. There are some other requirements, but as we discussed before about transparency and about, for example, actually one of the main things for this industry self-regulation is that under 18s are not supposed to be able to buy loot boxes unless and until the company has obtained explicit consent, explicit parental consent. But what we found is this is not something that actually happens. No company has implemented this. What companies might refer to would be, oh yeah, we offer some parental control features on our hardware, so you can put this onto your child's account and then they can't spend money unless you approve it. Yes, these measures do exist, but they require the parent to firstly know that they exist and then undertake the efforts to properly get this implemented onto their child's accounts and then actively enforce it to make sure that it continues to work. This is, for the informed parents, sure, they might do this, but a lot of parents are not going to be setting this out. What we have suggested before is that things like these protective features should be on by default. At the moment, they're off by default, right? Unless and until you turn them on. Another thing that would be relevant here, actually, no, never mind. I think it's escaped
No,
me.
go on. Okay.
No, I don't remember what I was going to say. Yeah, no.
One of my questions for you is just regard to terminology. So recently, Fortnite activated a element within their game that said allow paid randomized items, which is essentially loot boxes. What you were saying earlier about informed parents is the terminology around loot boxes. Obviously, I can understand why the industry would want to move away from that term, even though it's commonly widespread. What other elements or terms are being used to describe loot boxes?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that is just a euphemism and actually a way to sort of evade responsibility, because actually loot boxes is what people, or at least probably the most number of people, would understand. If you actually say loot boxes, then parents know exactly what you're talking about. But if you say things like randomized in-game purchases or include in-game purchases in brackets includes random items, they're not very clear. Some parents might look at that and think in this game you can defeat enemies and get random rewards, not realizing that you actually have to spend money to get random rewards. Yes, that is certainly something that is happening. And you've actually reminded me what I was going to say is that in relation to the parental control features, you also see this sort of attempt to hide important information. So, for example, when a child wants to buy something on the Apple devices, and if the parental control features are turned on, what would happen is the parents will get a request. For example, that the child wants to purchase 100 green gems. Or sometimes it's even more vague. Your child wants to purchase offer 76. And it doesn't say this is a loot box. And it does not say that then your child will use the green gems to purchase loot boxes. So all of this information is lost. So even if you have turned on the parental control features and you have been informed what your child wants to buy, this is not sufficient information that's been given. You're just being told they want to buy something. It doesn't actually say anything about them wanting to buy loot boxes. Same with the terminology that you use in an example. It's not clear what it is.
And I think every game manufacturer and developer does exactly the same thing. They have different words and different terms for their prizes and for these mechanisms. And it's, as a parent, it's a real struggle to keep on top of it, to understand, is a battle pass a loot box? Is whatever given game my son will be playing holding a loot box mechanism in it? So just moving slightly aside, I believe it is different, but can you just explain the relationship between skin betting and loot boxes?
Sure. So loot boxes are the mechanics that you find inside the game. So inside this game, the game company offers you opportunities to spend money to get random rewards. That is it. That is the end of loot boxes. But what skin betting is something that requires virtual items inside games to be tradable and transferable between players for it to happen. Skin betting actually does not require a loot box to exist, although they often exist in parallel. But skin betting can in theory exist without loot boxes. What skin betting is people, because they can trade the virtual items that they have inside video games, that virtual item has a real world monetary value, because I can always transfer that virtual item to you and you can pay me some money outside of the game and we can do this transfer. So these virtual items have real world value. Now, most, if not all, video game companies set out very clearly that these virtual items are not supposed to have any monetary value. You're not supposed to transfer them in exchange for real money, etc., etc. But the truth of the matter is people are doing it. And actually, just 2 weeks ago, we got a Court of Appeal decision in England and Wales setting out very clearly that the virtual premium currency that you can transfer between players in RuneScape is property within the meaning of the Theft Act. So we do expect the law to treat these virtual items as property in other contexts as well, because it is common sense. So what skin betting is, with these virtual items that has a real world monetary value, people are using them instead of real money to bet on random events. So they can use their skins to bet on roulette, to play poker, or to bet on the results of esports matches. They can do anything with it because it's basically money. It's like cryptocurrency even. You can think of it that way. So the connection between skin betting and loot boxes is that for a lot of games, and generally with skin betting, the game that we're concerned about is Counter-Strike. With the Counter-Strike skins that you can use to perform skin betting, you can also get those skins, and in fact, most, if not all of the time, you are getting those skins out of the loot box. So they came from the loot boxes. But technically, it's not required that you get them through the loot box. You can also just buy the skins with real money from other players, and then you can participate in skin betting without them. Yes, that, as you can see, quite confusing.
Okay. Well, you mentioned about the regulation, and I think it's one of your LinkedIn posts that first made me connect with you. In terms of, we'll discuss first the UK. You've been holding the UK policymakers to account in terms of a delay in the regulatory report that they were due to publish at the end of last year, and we're still waiting for the release now. How is the UK in terms of its regulatory control of loot boxes in comparison to other countries, and what are the next steps that we can expect?
Yes. So with our report, to be fair, the government has not said that it would be published late last year.
Oh,
It
okay.
just said in about July, if I recall correctly, of last year, that it would be published soon. But we kind of thought soon would be a couple of months, but soon is turning out to be quite long. But I think also 2 weeks ago, we did get confirmation in the comments. The government said that it will be published this year. I guess we can say perhaps late this year, but we are expecting this soon. So in terms of comparing the UK with other countries, to be honest, the Advertising Standards Authority, which is the advertising regulator in the UK, has actually proactively done a decent amount of enforcement compared to other countries whose regulators haven't done as much. So there is that. They have done something. The problem with the advertising regulator is that it is also an industry self-regulator of the advertising industry. So its powers are limited. It cannot fine companies for not complying, for example. But we do have companies that repeatedly contravene advertising regulations. And what is supposed to happen when this occurs is that then the advertising regulator is supposed to refer the matter to the consumer regulator, which would be the Competition and Markets Authority, which is the government department that has the power to criminally prosecute companies for breaking not advertising regulations, but consumer law. But advertising regulations, they implement consumer law. So when you breach advertising regulations, you're likely breaching consumer law. That is the sort of strong enforcement action that is required, and that is not happening in the UK. To be fair, it is also not happening elsewhere very much. I would say generally across the world, not very much has happened. You have, for example, Belgium is a rather prominent example that people like to talk about because Belgium, technically, it has been said that Belgium has this ban on loot boxes. Yes, in theory, that is correct because their law is such, their gambling law is such that there is a ban on loot boxes, not just for children, but also for adults, because loot boxes constitute unlicensed illegal gambling under their law. But the problem is that law is not being enforced. We're finding that many games are still selling loot boxes in Belgium. So yes, we can point to some examples of other countries having done different things, but those measures haven't really been enforced very well either. But some other approaches would be, for example, in Germany and in Australia, now games with loot boxes must receive an minimum age rating. So if a game contains loot boxes, it has to be at least 12 plus in Germany and at least 15 plus in Australia. It doesn't matter what the rest of the game is. That's the minimum age rating it must at least carry. Whilst in contrast in the UK, age ratings are done by PEGI, and they do not consider whether or not a game contains loot boxes as part of the age rating decision. Now, they do highlight whether or not the game contains loot boxes, not in a very prominent way, but they do note that information. But this information is not taken into account as part of the age rating decision, which continues to be based on how violent the game is or how much sexual content there is inside the game. That is, the loot box presence is not taken into account. But Germany and Australia have started changing that. In Asian countries, we've had the transparency requirements that we talked about earlier in the UK that sort of exists as industry self-regulation, but also in theory as consumer law. But in Asia, those rules have been explicitly stated in laws that specifically deal with just loot boxes. From our research, we do seem to see better compliance. It's still not perfect. There's still significant room for improvement. But when that is put on a legal footing and there's an explicit law setting this out, we do see more media reporting on this. We do see more player attention being paid to it. And I think there is an improvement. But yeah, generally across the world, not great.
I was just going to say, it strikes me, it's like prize draws over in the UK, they're unregulated at the moment. And I think with anything that's new, it falls between different bodies. So you mentioned the Advertising Standards Authority, and some people believe they should be picking it up. Others believe it should be fall under the remit of the Gambling Commission. The Gambling Commission are obviously, at full stack with their workload and their ability to monitor the existing gambling ecosystem without the loot boxes added on top. And it just falls between different departments of whether it's the games industry. And with that, nobody really takes real ownership of it. And then the product or the game evolves over time, and regulation is always one step behind the innovation of the ecosystem.
I would agree with that sentiment. Yes, certainly it is a gray area to a certain extent. But what I would say here, though, is that in relation to the Gambling Commission, we do have specific examples of loot boxes that would fall within the definition of illegal gambling under UK law. It would also fall within what the Gambling Commission previously published in a position paper as their interpretation of what kind of loot box might contravene gambling law. We do have those examples, and we have referred those examples to the Gambling Commission, but it has not done anything other than we are investigating this. The Advertising Standards Authority, its remit is very wide. It's supposed to regulate all advertising. And in fact, I think probably the video game side of things has taken quite a bit of resources away from them. It's only one of many industries they're supposed to regulate, and they're taking responsibility, which is good that they're doing this. I'm not, I'm conscious that perhaps it's not supposed to be the video game regulator, but it's kind of performing that role to a certain extent in the UK, intentionally.
And just how do you see loot boxes evolving in the next 5 years?
Personally, I don't think much will change. I think this will continue. We are supposed to be getting some more loot box regulation in the EU as part of this forthcoming Digital Fairness Act that we're expecting also later this year. We've also seen Brazil prohibit loot boxes from games that are designed for under 18s or are likely to be accessed by under 18s. Like, we're seeing these things happening or might be happening, but my impression is not much will change in the next couple of years. I think it will be business as usual. I don't really see a wide prohibition of these mechanics coming. It is quite widely discussed, and I would say this is a misconception that loot boxes are somehow going away. You do see media reports talking about this. Some talk about, battle passes are replacing these. That's not true. Not true from our research. We're seeing the same prevalence of these mechanics. In fact, we're seeing games that didn't have these mechanics now introduce them. So, for example, Fortnite, a very long time ago, a small part of that game had loot boxes. Then Epic Games, the company behind Fortnite, took a stance and removed loot boxes from the games in their portfolio. But just earlier this year, they have allowed loot boxes to be implemented in sort of third-party content. And we have seen companies start implementing this. Apparently, this is to compete better with Roblox that, of course, allows these mechanics. So if anything, we're seeing an increase of the prevalence of these mechanics.
Yeah, I don't expect you to comment on this, but my observation is that I was so disappointed with Roblox in terms of other aspects of how they're conducting their ecosystem of games, in terms of child safety, in terms of chat, in terms of regulation, and loot boxes as well. So it's a bit disappointing from that aspect. I can't really work out, and you might be able to shed some light on it. Are you pro, or are you for or against loot boxes yourself, or where do you stand in terms of loot boxes as a personal opinion?
As a personal opinion, I probably should have decided this at some point, but for me, the research has always been that there is a specific regulation, and we just go and test whether that regulation is working or not. Sometimes I would be of the opinion that this regulation is over-regulation and is unlikely to work. I do have that opinion sometimes before we test a certain law based on, for example, previous results in other countries. As to this mechanic, I think perhaps it's because I've been working on this for a good number of years now. I think I've come to accept that, and I think it's what I said earlier in response to your previous question. I think it will continue. So I'm not sure my personal opinion really matters. This continues. So we just test what we can. We try to inform all stakeholders as to the measures that have been adopted. Is it actually helping people, or if this is a measure that that is appearing to somehow reduce risks and harms when it is not doing this. I guess we were just trying to fight against the misinformation. About loot boxes, I don't think we can really advocate one way or another. It doesn't really work. It just continues.
Yeah. And do the platforms or the consoles hold any position on them in terms of, PlayStation, Xbox, any of the streaming companies?
So yeah, the hardware, the big three, so Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft, with the big console hardwares, they were part of the working group on industry self-regulation for loot boxes that the UK government has convened. So they were certainly involved in the discussion. My understanding is what they do is they continue to allow it to happen. They don't really have a strong opinion. If companies want to publish games with these mechanics, they will allow them to be on it. Nintendo, I would say, perhaps have started pulling back from it. A couple of years ago, they made some games, Nintendo did, using their own IPs, Animal Crossing games, Mario Kart games, Fire Emblem games that included loot boxes. But most of those games, they have changed or pulled back. Fire Emblem, if I remember correctly, is still going, but the Animal Crossing game, the Mario Kart game, those no longer have the paid loot box. So I have to say maybe Nintendo has pulled back a little bit, but it's business as usual.
So as a final question, if you could wave a magic wand and implement one change, either regulatory or technical or culturally, what would make the biggest positive difference for young people and loot boxes?
I think the thing that I would like the most is just for companies to follow the rules that already exist. People like to talk about what new rules we could adopt, but we already have pre-existing rules. We already have promises that we made to consumers a decade ago as to the level of transparency that they can expect from all consumer transactions, and that includes video games. But that basic information is not being provided. So it would be great if companies could just comply with those pre-existing rules. And I think if they did that, they will be doing themselves a favor by showing social responsibility, which might dissuade some of the overregulation that may be coming. And related to that, and what might contribute to companies complying better, would be for the regulators who are responsible for enforcing, again, the same rules that already exist on the books to actually go and enforce them. Honestly, a criminal prosecution of just one company, a prominent company, for this, I think would very robustly dissuade other companies from continuing to just break rules without fearing any consequences. There should be consequences.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's a great place to stop. Dr. Leon, I have really enjoyed this chat. I found it super informative, and your insight into this is unbelievable. I think I connected with you about 3 months ago on LinkedIn. Your posts shed so much light and updates on it. So I want to thank you from that aspect. If people want to get in contact with you or want to connect with you, what's the best place to do so?
LinkedIn is great. I think now share all of the updates on LinkedIn. Previously, Twitter and X worked reasonably well, not really anymore. I'm also on Blue Sky, but LinkedIn is probably the best bet. Of course, you can find my contact details on my website.
Okay, well, I'll put all of the contact details in the show notes below here in the episode description. So that just leaves me to thank you once again for your time. If you have enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. It means the world. And I will see you in the next video. See ya.
Bye.